Hi, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for continuing to support the channel, and for those that are new here, please consider hitting the subscribe button, liking this video, and sharing it with your family and friends, or anyone really who you think would benefit from this content. So, what I want to talk about today is myth. The topic of myth, of course, is central to the Jungian discourse, if you will, and a lot of what you would do as if you want to study Jungian psychoanalysis, besides reading the theory and, of course, watching these videos, is engage with mythological content, be that through, visual sort of depictions of that or the written texts. You can also listen to them, obviously, and it would be best if they're passed on orally to you from, your forefathers, if you will. But today, what that often means in practice is you study symbols, and that means symbols. Of course, we've encountered them in other videos before, and especially if we think about alchemy, most of alchemy is symbolic, and in fact the entire journey that we go through, that we call individuation, is a symbolic journey, and the world for that matter is symbolic. But really the question, what is a symbol, has not really been asked or answered in this, at least by me, in this channel. And it is key, however, to understand the meaning of a symbol when we want to understand the meaning of mythology and sort of what myth, the function of myth and its position within this sort of the development of consciousness. So here's what we're going to do in this video today. First, we're going to look briefly at what a symbol is. Then we're going to look at myths and sort of a myth and its connection to the archetype, how that sort of flows into each other, how that fits into the general sort of architecture of the psyche, if you will. And then we'll briefly get into creation myths, and from creation myths move towards sort of what sort of the story of creation actually entails or suggests for the process of individuation, so the process of the differentiation of the self and the ego, and then the return of the ego and the self, or so they're alloying, if you will, they're merging, their connection in sort of this mythical axis, this ego-self axis. So let's browse through that and start. So a symbol, Jung says, is not the same as a sign. While a sign is a pointer to something known, the symbol implies something that is unknown and cannot be made clear or precise. And I think the key in this definition is in the last couple of words. So the symbol cannot be made clear or precise. That is, while you may not know the signify that the sign points toward, so you say, look, okay, well, this is a table here, right? I say table. The word table points toward this particular table. In this moment, it points towards this particular table. Now, we may have a philosophical discussion about whether I can't actually signify, like I can actually point at this table, and whether the pointing and the table that I point to are actually, sort of if they're actually related in any sense. It's like I say table, and it's like, yeah, but what exactly is this table? What makes it a table, and so on and so forth? And can, does it, if I say it's a table, do you also think it's a table, or do we mean the same thing when we think about tables? But that is all irrelevant. What is important is we can make the meaning of it clear and precise. That is, we point towards something that is, let's say, relatively one-dimensional. And this also pertains to, let's say, classical therapeutic interventions, where we have in a Lacanian context. I think Jung makes this differentiation, and again, this is Jung's opinion, right, I guess, or his analysis, or his differentiation between a symbol and a sign. But in Lacanian analysis, when you have sort of a signifier that points towards sort of a chain, if you will, of signs that are then sort of connected to some kind of traumatic event or whatever, or some kind of formation of a neurosis, or I'm not an expert on Lacan at all, but this would be sort of the classical, I guess, ego psychology thinking. Then Jung would still say, look, but that's all happening on the level of consciousness, as in you could make it conscious, and as in it's related to the ego, right, in that way. So it's a trauma, it's a problematic of the ego interpreting, perhaps wrongly, whatever it signifies, if you will, right? whereas a symbol is something that in its complexity cannot be made clear or precise. That is, let's say we look at the symbol of a cross, right? What does the cross signify? What does it mean? Well, you could say, well, it points towards the, the two crossing paths, and then you have the center of it, right? You have sort of a center that's drawn out, you have something to aim at. Then you could also connect it to the myth of Christ, the cross that you carry. You could also say it's the cross that you believe in, that you pray to, and what does that actually mean? And so the sort of the meaning becomes infinitely difficult to grasp or to catch. And in the end, then, Jung says the symbol is a means of communication for something that cannot be communicated in any other way. It is not a sign that stands for something known, but a hint of something known, but a hint at something not known and impossible to characterize in any other way. So it's really a process of bringing something into the world or characterizing something that otherwise you could not characterize or communicate. So it's very similar in that way to the process of art making, right? If you create a painting, and even art in the sense of, or a sculpture or whatever, but even art in the sense of literature, even if you create, I guess it's this sort of this process of introverted intuition in Jungian sense. It's like you have this intuition to communicate something, this connection to this beyond, and you want to bring it into the here and now, right? But you can't, right? Because it just doesn't work within the framework of the language that you're constrained by. And so that's what a symbol, I think, attempts in Jungian terms to do. And so what is the function of the symbol? We'll visit that later when we talked about mythology a little bit. Mythology as sort of a function of the symbol, as a form of a symbol. And we'll revisit the symbol when we get to sort of the discussion of the relation of myth and the symbol, more generally speaking, to the collective unconscious and its, let's say, mediation by the archetype. And then more concretely its function in the individuation process. But so how can we understand myth now as a symbol, but then also as a general sort of phenomena, let's say? So it's important here to note that I think we've discussed this in other videos, and I'll put the link somewhere and in the description as well, but essentially myth is the expression of a moment in time where the collective and the individual are not differentiated yet. So there's an overlap. The myth that we see as a historical sort of creation is created in a point in time, or if you will, in a state in which you see the ego and the self. If you think about the diagram of the ego differentiating from the self, so the ego is still engulfed by the self, right? So it's this moment of, or if you will, the moment of participation mystique. So the moment in which the archetypal field is still sort of engulfing the entirety of the personal field. Like there's no ability yet to realize that the sun and me are two different instances or two different entities. It's more like, if I don't pray this morning, the sun will not rise, right? So there's a direct link between me and the sun. And now the moment in which myth, or the moment which myth describes, as this pertains to creation myths in particular, is sort of the moment in which this unity becomes fractured. So something that has before been unconscious is now rising to consciousness, right? And if you think about, let's say, something like fairy tales, that's not necessarily present there, right? It is present in some extent. Fairy tales are essentially then a collection of symbols. But if we think about the most important sort of symbolic myth, which is creation myth, because that's important for the sort of the process of the individuation, then we can think of sort of a particle of the collective, of the unconscious, personal unconscious, being fractured and therefore being sort of contextualized within this mythological framework. And so Jung writes, all the mythologized processes of nature, such as summer and winter, the phases of the moon, the rainy seasons, and so forth, are in no sense allegories of these objective occurrences. Rather, they're symbolic expressions of the inner unconscious drama of the psyche, which becomes accessible to man's consciousness by way of projection, that is, mirrored in the events of nature. So the idea here is really, he says in another quote, myths and fairy tales give expressions to unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again and be recollected, thereby re-establishing the connection between consciousness and the unconscious. What the separation of the two psychic halves means, the psychiatrist knows only too well, and so on. But so here's, before we get to the second quote, let's stay with the first one and say, the myths are the expression of inner occurrences in terms of natural phenomena or natural terminology. Let's say, a tree talks to another tree or whatever, then that would be sort of an inner process. It's not actually that the tree talks to the other tree, but it's sort of the expression of an inner process. And this is how Jung also understands, dreams then, right? If you think about how is a dream and a myth, how are they different, Jung essentially says, strictly speaking, the myth has as a unique historical event is like a dream, an individual dream which has a place and a time sequence. So it's like you have this dream as sort of a myth on the individual level, and all the myth then becomes for Jung is this sort of this projected inner state on sort of a narrative that occurs in relatable terms. So again, it's this process of making something uncommunicatable communicatable. So if you can communicate something, you tend to mythologize it, right? And this, again, if you think on a process level, this moment in which you can communicate something is a moment in which this something is still unconscious, because literally that's what it means, not being able to communicate something. So you have a sentiment that you cannot communicate, and so you put it in a projected state. You project it outward, and you build the mythology around it. And the point here is, however, that this is not conscious, right? Like, it's not like I'm sitting here, I'm looking outside, and I'm like, oh yeah, my love for you is like the velvet of the roses that grow in my garden. I don't know, but it's more like there's something that is present in me, something that wants to get out, but that something cannot be communicated. I cannot speak what it is that I mean. And that's why I say it in an entirely different terminology, let's say, right? And this mythologizing is sort of all present in the entirety of the sort of the interaction with the outside, in this state that I mentioned in the earlier in this video of participation mystique, that's all encompassing, so of a non-cut between the ego and self, right? Because I'm literally all I'm doing is projecting everything that's going on inside of me onto the outside. And so an important aspect here is that the myth itself, in its retelling, sets us up again in this very moment of the myth's occurrence. So it sets the stage, if you will, for the re-experiencing of that certain sentiment, let's say, of that numinosity. And so here, it's very important, to link it back to the work of, let's say, Mircea Eliade. Mircea Eliade, where Mircea Eliade has this idea of the sacred and profane space. And sort of, if you think about this in terms of, he, of course, one level of the argument is that basically sacred space is that which you reenact from before time. So it's sort of if you're in this state of participation mystique, then what you attempt to do is that every step of your way is in respect of that which you project on, because the entirety of the cosmos is interconnected. And so if I make a false step, then the world may fall apart. It's not about my fate, it's about my community's fate, it's about the world's fate in general, right? So that's one element of it. So I continuously live in the sacred time. But then another way of looking at it is that you have a constant sort of circulating around certain moments within within, let's say, a canonical cultural canon, or communities canon, and we'll get to a term for that in a second that I don't want to foreshadow, where it's like you have certain central myths that you reiterate, and thereby reiterating them, you situate yourselves again in accordance with that myth, and that sets you, let's say, navigationally, literally in terms of navigation, sets you up sort of on the horizon of that which you should be sort of aligned with, if you will. And that would correspond to sacred time. It would correspond to this moment of communitas, where you're constantly setting yourself up within this body of Christ, if you will, right? This body of again, of sacrality, right? And this occurs, Jung says again, myths and fairy tales give expressions to the unconscious processes, and their retelling causes these processes to come alive again and be recollected, thereby reestablishing the connection between conscious and unconscious. So again, what's happening here, and how can we think about the reiteration of the sacred time, right? What happens here? Why do we have to continuously pray? And the idea here is, on this level, that you have to do that in order to establish a connection to the sacrality, to the sacred, to the unconscious, if that is the case. And this, of course, relates to the ego-self axis, right? So, and importantly, however, we have to make sure that in the moment that we're speaking of, so when this sort of, Jung calls it the primitive sort of mind, where ego and self are not differentiated, you have no ego-self axis. So in that moment, this prayer or this reiteration of the myth is it's not a matter of sort of abstractly connecting the self connecting to an abstract God, but it's a literal matter of life and death. It's like, if I don't perform this ritual, the crops will not grow, literally, right? And of course, this is just an outward projection of the inner process, right? It's as if I don't, it's the process is I connect to my unconscious, thereby establishing this axis to between the ego and the self, right? And so let's now rush on to the connection between myth and the collective unconscious, right? Jung writes here again, the collective unconscious appears to consist of mythological motives or primordial images, for which reason myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology could be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. Certainly, right? Because that's exactly the level that you get to when you're sort of beneath, if you will, the level of the personal unconscious, right? When you're still on the level of projection, right? Importantly, however, this underlines the relevance of reading myths if you're interested in studying this material and interested in engaging with yourself. Because, and here's the thing, myths can put you in the state again in which sort of the myth creator was when they created the myth. And this is by way of sort of the archetypes. And remember now, in some of the last videos, I've been talking about the structure of the psyche. If you can, I'll link the video somewhere, where you have the psychic complexes in the unconscious that are sort of repressed or let's say subjugated by the central ego, the interpretive framework. At the core of these complexes, you can imagine them as like nodes or whatever, are the archetypes, right? And so these archetypes provide the trajectories along which these complexes can organize themselves, and thereby they provide the energy for the entire psychic processes, which is borrowed, right? It's a borrowed energy, if you will. And this is, of course, far-reaching consequences. But the point here is that you have the possibility of activating an archetype by way of which energy flows into consciousness and can get utilized. And so the idea here is that a myth can activate an archetype at the center of one of these complexes, thereby providing energy for the sort of the consciousness to move, ideally then towards this complex and into the archetype, sort of working through the material that is encountered. That would be an interesting gesture, right? And in another video, I would like to talk about sort of the danger of this, right? The danger actually of the archetype, the threat that this energy laden thing can actually provide to the psyche and to the stability of the ego, if not used wisely, let's say in a protected environment, right? This is why, just to foreshadow, mythological practices always took place in a collective, right? Never in an individual context, but in a collective. Because obviously, as we know, and this is sort of hinting at what we'll talk about in the next video or in another video, if you watch it after this, is up to you. But it's basically this idea that the ego needs to be individuated. Phase one, which is sort of the phase when consciousness gets different to the self and strengthened first before it can reconnect to the self. Because if you don't have the strengthened ego, you're threatened to have sort of a disruptive encounter that actually shatters you to the point of like psychosis, right? And this function of the individuated phase one ego is taken over by the projection of this individuated ego onto the collective body of the tribe or the sect or the community or whatever, in the rituals, as to protect its members from dismemberment, if you will, right? So they stand together as a group psyche, and Erich Neumann has interesting work on this in his Uranus lectures. They stand together as sort of this group that functions as a collective psyche that approaches this unknown with their collective sort of body, right? The idea here is that myth and the symbol, if you will, as well functions as a trigger of this unconscious energy that is hosted in the archetype at the center of the complex, and it thereby is an entry point, a gate into the work with the collective, and also a work with yourself, if you will, right? But it's a dangerous and careful to be used, right? And so, just to briefly then come to creation myth, the myth of creation, right, then occurs, therefore, over and over again in our own lives whenever there is an element of us that is sort of unconscious to us in that very moment, so we don't know about it. It's a complex that the ego has subjugated or repressed, if you will, or simply not included within the narrative that it has built. And this element comes forth, prompting us to sort of bring it to light again. So the sort of, if you will, the process of creation involving in this context, the separation and then the unity of the two opposites, right? You usually the creations, right, that we see occur by, or not usually, but often, by a third, right? You have sort of the mother and the father, and they're entangled in this eternal dance, and then they have a child, and this child sort of rips them apart. It's like, I don't have space here. I want, like, pushes them open, as you see, and then the mother becomes the heavens, or the father becomes the heavens, and the mother becomes the earth, right? And then the second generation, the children have children, and then this generation becomes somehow, let's say, there's some element of fall often, like you see in the Bible, for example. You have Eve engaged with the evil, and she can see suddenly, and so she has to fall again, and so she falls on the actual ground, right? That's a creation story. It often involves light. Light, of course, as a symbol for consciousness. Like, how do you express consciousness, right? Well, you just say light, right? And that triggers, and here's again this link to the archetypal, right? Light for humanity in our historical context, if we get back to the sort of evolutionary historical interpretation of the archetypes, has so much significance, right? Because it's literally the light that the torch you carry through the night. Like, what better way of symbolizing the process of becoming conscious is there than saying it's a torch you carry through the unknown, like through the dark forest, like literally the dark and malevolent, dangerous world that we used to live in when we were still when there were no cities and it wasn't civilized, and we were up against wolves and all kinds of predatory beings that wanted to literally kill and eat us. And even before that, when we didn't have any weaponry or anything to defend ourselves, we were primates in trees, and it was kind of like, how must we have experienced the world and to form these symbols that are so old? It's incredible for me to think about, right? Right. So mythology teaches us, on the one hand, our own the process of our own disentanglement, right, from the depths within ourselves, and then Jung says that that's what we project outwards. But on the other hand, it teaches us, in doing so, the entire history of our own existence as humankind, if you will. And this is, of course, the fundamental lesson of the archetypal sort of entanglement that we have, is like, whenever you delve into yourself, but you also delve into the entire human history that came before us, right? So the idea that hell or your unconscious reaches all the way down to hell. It doesn't only reach down to your own hell, your own sins that you've done, and your perverted fantasies that you have. No. It doesn't stop there. It reaches down all the way to the kinds of perverted and disastrous and disgusting things that humanity has done in its entire history. Be it in the last 100 years, be it in the last 1,000 years, or in the last hundreds of thousands of years, And in that way, the process of creation, or the myth of creation, and the establishment of this light pole, this lighthouse in the middle of the ocean, that the name of which we can reveal now, the axis mundi, the center of the world, is an eternal process. It's a process that's constantly recurring over and over and over and over again. It's a process that we carry with us through space and time. We are the creators in that sense. And at the same time, we are the created, right? Well, thank you very much for tuning in and joining this session. I hope you enjoyed it. I am curious to hear what you think, and please post your questions and remarks in the comment section. I'll respond to them, and I will, make videos if there's anything relevant you wanna hear me go into more depth on. Thank you very much, and please hit subscribe and turn on the notifications also on this video, so you're always the first one to know whenever there's new content coming up. Thanks so much. Have a great day.